It was a Friday night when the doorbell rang 3 times, the kind of sound that cuts through the quiet of an apartment and makes you sense that something important is about to happen. My name is Cambria Nolan, 35, a financial analyst living in Pittsburgh. And for the first time in years, I felt genuinely proud of myself. That morning, my manager had congratulated me on my promotion and the raise I had worked toward for a decade. When I opened the door, my mother stood there holding a store-bought cake. My father followed, 2 paper cups of cheap wine in hand, his grin failing to reach his eyes. "We heard the good news," Mom said, brushing past me before I could respond. "Our daughter finally made it." I let them in, the air thick with perfume and old tension. They settled at the kitchen table, as if they still lived there. Dad clinked his cup against mine. "To family," he said, smiling that heavy smile that always meant a request was coming. After a few polite exchanges, Mom leaned back, her voice sharp yet calm. "You know we deserve half, after everything we've done for you." The room went silent. I watched the second hand sweep past 12, the longest 3 seconds of my life. Then I stood, walked to the counter, and picked up the envelope I had prepared earlier. I placed it gently in front of them. They opened it, their confident expressions slipping into confusion. No one spoke. I took a slow breath, met their gaze, and said softly, "That's everything you need." I turned away, leaving them in that silence. If you've ever been guilt-tripped by your own parents, stay with me. You'll see how far manipulation can go when love twists into control. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, I assumed it was a flood of work emails, maybe a team update or a reminder from my manager. But as I reached for the screen, the brightness of the notifications felt almost blinding. Over 50 social media alerts waited. When I opened one, my chest tightened. Mom had posted a long message about me on Facebook, complete with old pictures and carefully chosen words meant to sting. The post began, "Some children forget who raised them once they start earning money," and ended with, "No parent deserves to be treated this way." Within hours, it spread across multiple Pittsburgh neighborhood pages. People I barely remembered were sharing it, adding comments full of disappointment and pity. My old neighbor wrote, "I knew that girl always thought she was better than everyone." My mother's friends responded with hearts and prayer emojis, calling her a saint. Every line, every reaction felt like a small public trial I hadn't agreed to. When I arrived at the office, the air felt heavier than usual. Conversations stopped as I passed. I could feel eyes tracking me, curious, judgmental. At lunch, my HR supervisor asked me into her office for a quick chat. The blinds were half closed, her voice soft but deliberate. "Cambria, I don't want to pry," she said. "But is everything okay at home?" Her question sounded kind, yet it carried the weight of gossip. I nodded, forcing a smile, though my stomach churned with something sour and heavy. Back at my desk, my phone buzzed again. A text from Dad. His messages always arrived like lectures, long, emotional, and weighted. This one was no different. He wrote about loyalty, about how children owe everything to their parents. "After all we've done, this is how you treat us." The message stretched on for paragraphs, guilt packed into every line until the final words, "You'll regret this." I stared at the screen until the words blurred, unsure if I was angry or just exhausted. Late in the afternoon, a neighbor sent a photo. Mom was standing in front of my apartment, tissue in hand, tears streaking her makeup, recorded from across the street. She had turned pain into performance, the internet her stage. I placed my phone face down and sat in silence. Outside, faint laughter echoed, but I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. That evening, as the sky turned a dull shade of blue, my phone rang again. For a second, I braced for another message from Mom or Dad. But it was my grandmother, Eleanor Nolan. Her voice carried a steadiness I hadn't heard all day. "Let them talk," she said gently. "The truth will outlive the noise." She didn't ask for details. She didn't scold or offer empty comfort. She simply reminded me, in her calm and certain way, that silence can be stronger than chaos. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room. The faint smell of last night's wine lingered in the air, mingling with cold coffee. My apartment felt too quiet and too alive at once, humming with the pulse of a city that would forget today's gossip by tomorrow. I realized Grandma was right. Truth doesn't need to shout to survive. It waits, patient and steady, while the noise burns itself out. 2 weeks later, I drove to her small house on the edge of Harrisburg. When I parked in front of the familiar white porch, she was waiting, wrapped in her thick cardigan, the same one she wore when something serious was on her mind. Inside, the smell of chamomile tea and lemon bread filled the kitchen. Grandma poured me a cup before I could even take off my coat. Her calmness was disarming, as if she had been expecting me long before I called. I hadn't come to talk about what happened online. I came because the night before, I found a white envelope slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a letter stamped with the seal of the Dauphin County Court. It was an official notice. My parents had filed a petition. I took the letter from my bag and set it on the table. Grandma's eyes moved slowly over the page, her lips tightening. "I got one too," she said quietly, reaching for a second envelope on the counter. The paper was already creased from being folded and unfolded many times. "They've asked me to testify as a witness. It's a parental support petition." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The term hung between us, unfamiliar yet heavy. "They're suing me," I finally whispered. "For support." Grandma nodded, her expression unreadable. "They're claiming you owe them financial assistance for their care." I sank back into the chair, the wood pressing into my spine. The idea of my own parents using the court system to demand money felt surreal, almost absurd, yet the documents in front of me were painfully real. Grandma placed her hand over mine. "You need to find legal help," she said. "Don't fight them with anger. That's what they want. Fight them with reason." Her words were steady, but I could hear the disappointment underneath, not in me, but in what our family had become. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. That evening, I reached out to my friend and former college classmate, Grace Turner, now a civil lawyer. She agreed to meet me after work. We sat in a small coffee shop near downtown Harrisburg. Grace had always been sharp, practical, and slightly intimidating in the best possible way. She scanned the court papers while I stirred my untouched drink, watching the fluorescent lights ripple across the surface. "They're using an old state law," she said after a few minutes. "It allows parents to request financial support from adult children if the parents are indigent. It's outdated and rare, but it still exists." I tried to absorb her words. Grace sighed softly. "Can they actually win?" "Technically, yes, if they prove financial hardship and show that you can afford to pay. But most judges dismiss these cases when they see manipulation. Still, it could damage your professional reputation if it becomes public. Employers don't always read between the lines." A dull ache pressed behind my temples. "So, they're not just after money. They're trying to embarrass me." Grace nodded. "They want control, not justice. People like that don't handle rejection well." Outside, dusk had settled over the city, streetlights glowing through a thin drizzle. Grace reached across the table. "I'll help you, but you need to stay composed. No social media responses, no messages to them. Let the legal process speak for you." Her tone was firm and protective, like a doctor giving strict instructions to a patient who refuses to rest. When I finally drove home, the windshield wipers moved in a slow rhythm, matching the steady beat of my heart. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't just a family conflict. It was a legal battle, and my parents were willing to drag me through every inch of it. But Grandma's words stayed with me, quiet, steady. "Don't fight with anger. Fight with reason." By early spring, another white envelope from the court appeared in my mailbox. Thin, yet somehow heavy in my hands, as if it carried the weight of every conversation I'd avoided. Inside was a summons demanding my presence in court 2 weeks from that day. The words were printed in cold black ink. "You are required to appear before the Dauphin County Court in response to a parental support petition." Below that, my parents' names stood bold and formal, as though they were strangers instead of the people who raised me. I sat at my kitchen table, reading the notice again and again, hoping to find a line that proved it was some kind of mistake. There wasn't one. Enclosed was a packet labeled evidence submitted by the petitioners. I opened it with shaking hands and saw several pages of screenshots, text messages apparently from me promising to send them monthly financial support. The dates were recent, the tone polite, even affectionate. But I had never written them. The number sending the messages was similar to mine, just one digit off. When I met with Grace the next morning, she was already pacing her office, a cup of coffee untouched beside her laptop. After scanning the documents, she said, "They've fabricated evidence. This isn't emotional manipulation anymore. It's fraud." Her words echoed inside me. Grace immediately began gathering every legitimate message I had ever exchanged with my parents. I forwarded my entire history, texts, call logs, email threads. She told me to request records from my phone carrier to prove the fake number wasn't mine. At her instruction, I also collected payroll statements, bank records, and tax filings from the past 5 years. Each file became part of a growing binder labeled defense. Grace was methodical, steady, and ruthless in her precision. "They want to paint you as someone who abandoned them," she said. "So, we'll show you've been independent, responsible, and honest. That's the truth." And the truth leaves a paper trail. That weekend, Grandma called. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to sound calm. "I wrote a letter to the court," she said. "They asked for my statement, so I told them the truth, that you left home at 18, paid for your own college, and never once asked for help." A lump rose in my throat. Grandma had always spoken plainly, but her words carried the quiet force of decency. "Thank you," I whispered, though it felt like too small a phrase for what she had done. 2 days later, I received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Last chance." The message was brief. "Pay up or we'll ruin you." No signature, no traceable address, just the cold threat lingering on my screen. My pulse quickened, but fear quickly gave way to resolve. I took a screenshot, attached it to an email, and forwarded it to Grace with a note. "Add this to the file." That night, rain drummed against the windows as I sat on the couch, reviewing every document one last time. My living room looked like a war room. Folders spread across the floor, post-it notes color-coded by topic, a stack of legal printouts beside my laptop. Yet amid the chaos, I felt strangely calm. I wasn't alone anymore. Grace was guiding me. Grandma had spoken up, and the truth, silent but steady, was on my side. When I finally closed the binder labeled defense, Cambria Nolan, I exhaled deeply. The court date was approaching fast, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a victim in their story. I was preparing to tell my own. The courthouse smelled of paper and fear. The air was thick with floor polish, nervous whispers, and the faint click of reporters' pens. I sat beside Grace at the defendant's table, palms pressed flat against the smooth surface to steady my breathing. The courtroom was nearly full. A few local journalists whispered and pointed cameras toward my parents. They looked smaller than I remembered, yet their presence filled the room with tension. When the bailiff called the session to order, the judge entered, a tall man with gray hair and the kind of tired eyes that had seen too many family disputes. He glanced briefly at each of us before nodding to the clerk. "This hearing concerns the petition for parental financial support filed by Howard and Linda Nolan against their daughter, Cambria Nolan." Hearing my name in that cold, official tone made my stomach tighten. Mom was the first to speak. She clutched a tissue, her voice trembling in a way that felt rehearsed. "Your Honor," she said, "we did everything for her. We supported her education, her dreams, and her life, but she abandoned her family when we needed her most." Her words cracked mid-sentence as she dabbed at her eyes, while Dad placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, the perfect picture of sorrow. A few people in the gallery murmured softly, sympathy drifting toward her like dust. Grace stood calmly when the judge invited her to respond. "Your Honor," she began, "my client has been financially independent since she turned 18. The petitioners are not destitute. They continue to own 2 properties in Allegheny County, one of which is rented for income. In addition, both receive social benefits and retirement payments. The alleged financial hardship is unfounded." Her voice was measured but firm, cutting through the air with precision. The judge frowned slightly and turned to my parents. "Do you have documentation of your financial situation?" he asked. Mom hesitated before sliding a folder forward. Grace stepped closer to inspect it. "These are recent bank statements," she said. However, the listed transactions include recurring rental deposits, confirming property income. The courtroom fell silent. Mom's hands trembled as she tried to explain, but the judge raised his hand, signaling her to stop. Then the clerk announced the next witness. The doors at the back opened, and my grandmother, Eleanor Nolan, entered slowly, leaning on her wooden cane. Every sound seemed to fade as she made her way to the stand. When she took the oath, her voice was soft yet unwavering. "They have lived off her since she got her first job," she said, her gaze fixed firmly on the judge. "I love my son and daughter-in-law, but truth matters more than comfort. She never owed them anything except respect, and she's given that plenty." The words landed like a strike of lightning. Mom's face flushed red. Dad looked down. The judge scribbled a few notes before setting his pen aside. Grace handed him a final document, the one that had been sealed months ago in that first envelope. "This," she said, "is a notarized declaration of financial independence, signed by both parties 3 years ago, confirming that Ms. Nolan has no ongoing financial obligation to her parents. It was drafted by a previous attorney at their own request to protect her income when she first began working." The judge read the document, adjusted his glasses, and nodded. "In light of this, the court finds the petition not only baseless, but deceptive. The case is dismissed. Furthermore, the petitioners will be fined for presenting falsified evidence." The gavel struck once, firm and final. As the room erupted into murmurs, I turned slightly toward my parents. Mom's tear-streaked face twisted into something colder, a mixture of fear and hatred. Dad avoided my eyes entirely. I stood slowly, leg steady, voice silent. Grace gathered our papers, and Grandma gave me a small nod from across the aisle, her expression calm, proud, and infinitely tired. When I stepped out of the courthouse, the spring air hit my face like sunlight after a storm. I thought of that envelope I had given them months ago, the one they never understood. Inside it had been the very document that protected me today, a single sheet of paper declaring freedom, not from family but from manipulation. A week after the verdict, Pittsburgh couldn't stop talking. The story spread faster than anyone expected, carried by whispers in offices, coffee shops, and church basements. The Pittsburgh Herald ran the headline in bold black letters, "Parents lose case against daughter." Beneath it, my name appeared again, smaller but impossible to miss. People debated it on morning radio, some praising my courage, others calling the entire ordeal a tragedy. I stopped listening after the second day. At work, colleagues tried to act normal, but there was always that subtle pause before anyone mentioned family. My supervisor left a note on my desk, "Proud of you for standing your ground." It wasn't much, but it meant more than any apology I've ever received from your parents. The HR manager later told me she had received calls from employees wanting to know how the case ended, proof that gossip travels faster than justice ever can. That Sunday, the local church bulletin mentioned the moral decay of filial respect. I knew exactly who they meant. The congregation that once adored Mom and Dad now looked at them differently. Some of their closest friends stopped inviting them to gatherings. One neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, who had lived beside them for 20 years, reportedly refused to open her door when Mom came to talk. For people who once thrived on image and sympathy, the silence must have been unbearable. Midweek, Grace emailed me a scanned letter embossed with a seal of the Pennsylvania Bar Association. She had nominated the case for a civil rights publication, and the review board had accepted it. Her message read, "You made legal history today. Very few cases under this law have ever been publicly overturned. Be proud, but stay private." I smiled for the first time in days. It wasn't victory, I realized, just a strange, grounded kind of relief. That evening, my phone rang. It was Grandma, Eleanor Nolan. Her voice was tired but gentle. "They had to sell the house," she said softly. The fine and legal fees left them no choice. They moved into a smaller place near Greensburg. I don't think they'll reach out again, at least not soon. I closed my eyes and let the silence between us breathe. Are you all right with that? She asked. I thought for a moment. I'm not happy, I said finally, but I'm not angry either. Maybe that's enough for now, she murmured kindly before hanging up. Later that night, I walked along the Monongahela River. The city lights shimmered on the dark surface, rippling with the wind. The air was cold, sharp, alive. I leaned on the railing, watching the reflections twist and scatter like fragments of an old photograph. I didn't feel triumphant, nor broken, just lighter, as if the invisible weight I had carried since childhood had finally lifted. The bridge ahead glowed faintly, and for the first time in months, I realized that peace doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it arrives when the noise fades, and you no longer feel the need to explain yourself. 3 months later, the first snow fell over Pittsburgh. The city seemed quieter under the soft white blanket, as if winter itself wanted to erase the noise surrounding my name. I had moved into a small apartment near downtown, on the 8th floor of a brick building overlooking the river. The view wasn't perfect, but the silence was. I furnished it slowly with secondhand pieces and things that felt like mine: a blue velvet chair, a thrifted lamp, a record player. For the first time in years, every corner of my home reflected one voice, my own. One morning, I opened the mailbox in the lobby and found a small envelope addressed in delicate handwriting. It was from Grandma. Inside was a simple birthday card with gold edges and a handwritten line: "You did the right thing. Love, Grandma." I held it for a long moment before placing it on my kitchen shelf. It wasn't about approval, it was acknowledgement. In a family where truth had often been twisted into guilt, her words were an anchor that steadied me. A few days later, another letter arrived. The handwriting was familiar but jagged, the ink pressed deep into the paper. It was from Mom. The note began with a story about her health problems, followed by a request for help with medical bills. There were no apologies, no mention of the court, only the same quiet expectation that I would step back into the role they had assigned me long ago. I folded the letter neatly, sealed it in an envelope without replying, and dropped it in the trash. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't ache. I simply knew that silence was sometimes the only boundary that works. Later that week, I called a local welfare office, the same place that had once handled part of their case filings. The clerk confirmed that the parental support petition was permanently closed, marked in the system as resolved without appeal. Hearing those words out loud felt like closing a door that had been left open for years. I thanked the clerk, hung up, and stood by the window for a while, watching the faint snow drifting past the glass. That night, I made dinner for myself. Nothing fancy, just pasta tossed with garlic and olive oil, a glass of red wine, and soft jazz playing from the old record player. The notes filled the apartment like warmth seeping through the walls. For the first time, I didn't feel like someone who had survived something terrible. I felt like someone who had finally learned how to live. Outside, snow gathered on the railings and rooftops, muting the city's usual hum. I pressed my palm against the cold window pane and let the silence settle inside me. Freedom doesn't shout. It doesn't demand to be noticed or celebrated. It arrives quietly, like the first snow over Pittsburgh, soft, certain enough. Half a year later, Grandma passed away peacefully. The news reached me on a quiet morning in late June through a phone call from one of her church friends. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, receiver in hand, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. Grief did not rush in all at once. It arrived slowly, like mist spreading through an open field. The funeral was small and gentle, held at the same church where she had sung in the choir for decades. People came not to mourn, but to honor a woman whose kindness had never demanded recognition. When it was my turn to speak, I unfolded the letter she had left for me. The handwriting was firm, each word deliberate. Love isn't a transaction. It isn't earned through sacrifice or measured by what you give. It's the freedom to care without keeping score. My voice trembled halfway through, but I finished. The silence that followed felt like a blessing. Among her final wishes, Grandma left me her small house near Greensburg. The real estate agent said it could sell quickly. The market was strong. I didn't hesitate. Within a month, I sold the property and donated every dollar to a local foundation that helps women recover from financial abuse. Signing the check felt like the truest way to honor her life, not through inheritance, but through the continuation of her quiet strength. In a recorded message played during the ceremony, I said, "That first envelope didn't end our bond. It just told the truth. Love isn't debt." Some people nodded. Others wiped their eyes. I meant every word. That envelope, once a symbol of defiance, had become a bridge between who I was and who I had to become. After the funeral, I returned to my Pittsburgh apartment. I began to live simply. Work, read, cook, sleep. No calls came from Mom or Dad, and I didn't expect any. The silence between us had hardened into permanence, and strangely, it didn't hurt. I watered my plants, paid my bills, and learned that peace can look very ordinary. Sometimes, when I walked downtown and past the courthouse, I slowed my steps. The building stood solemn beneath the gray sky, its stone facade cold but certain. I could still hear Grandma's words echoing in memory. Courage has quiet footsteps. It was her final lesson that bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply keeps walking, even after everyone else has stopped. I no longer looked back with anger or pity. Life had moved forward, and so had I. In the quiet rhythm of my days, there was no bitterness left, only understanding. Every choice carried its own consequence, and I had no regrets. Some people love you only while you're paying their bills. When you stop, they call you selfish. But walking away isn't cruelty, it's clarity. You can't save people who confuse love with obligation, nor should you try. Freedom begins the moment you stop apologizing for setting boundaries. It doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you whole. It makes you free. Thank you for staying till the end. If this story reminded you of a moment when you had to choose peace over guilt, share your thoughts in the comments. I read every story. Your experiences matter more than you know. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories about courage, truth, and the quiet kind of strength that changes everything.